there would, and you wanted to provide surface parking, there would be actually less surface to provide it on. So that would be a challenge. If you were to rebuild it as a grocery store, you'd probably have to look at something like podium parking or something along those lines.
More expensive building.
Yeah, if you wanted to make a larger building.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, what the proposed code does, and this is the whole intent, is around flexibility, is to say because the minimums are lower than what's currently required, and so if the current owners or some future owners decided they wanted to do something different with that site, you could potentially rebuild the same footprint of a building, and you could go 1 or 2 stories higher depending on what those uses were, and still be able to meet your parking need on site.
Well,
but you wouldn't have that option. Again, it's not forcing someone to do that. It's just providing that option if they or their lenders decide that that's financially feasible to do.
And also, just to finish up, also, I mean, our goal was to add housing on the corridor. So the ideal would be that they would build back their grocery store, plus put, I mean, in it, it's harder to get people to go upstairs for groceries, but plus put housing above. So then there would be an additional parking demands for the housing that you would, and then I think that's our long-term goal, is that you would, you'd still have a grocery store on the ground floor, but you'd have housing above it, which would put even more pressure on the existing site for parking.
Yeah, correct. And that would be possible to do with a proposed code. You might run into trouble with that with the existing code with parking minimums.
Yeah.
Commissioner Taylor.
And some of this might actually be better, some of this, what I'm going to say, might actually be better tabled for the latter half of this meeting. But I just wanted to note that when I read some of the comments by the business owners, one of the things that I would like us to be prepared for is the transition. I know you've been thinking about that. And let's say, using Capella as an example, that they are going to maintain their current use, and there might be possibilities that some of the business owners want to maintain their parking and their current use, yet as other adjacent properties are potentially enhancing their sidewalks and meeting some of those requirements. And let's say some want to do that. So it would impact Capella, and that's where that reduction in their existing parking would go down. So if they enhance the sidewalk, am I understanding that correctly?
I'm not sure I understand that.
So if they improve their sidewalks, is it impacting that row of parking that's right up against the sidewalk? Is that what they're talking about, 30% loss?
So if the long-term street side design would be built, that would basically remove that first long row of parking along the street.
And also the row of the parking on that south side.
On that south side.
Yeah.
So that's what I was...
But again, just to be clear, we're not proposing that happen. That's just on the table now as an option for property owners if they rebuild.
So what I'm looking at is, let's say a business owner is on board. They want to be part of enhancing that streetscape, yet they've got a successful business. And really reading through all of the meeting reports, actually, from both, and looking at the encouragement to allow for decreased density or decreased parking is flexible in terms of decreasing. What I would like to see is flexibility in terms of increasing, because of, for instance, like the story with Capella. They're losing 30% of their parking. So I actually think by allowing for density, decreased parking, and this is where I would really encourage the city to look at a public parking lot. So essentially what's going on with downtown is, in order to do that and have there be true flexibility and success for this area, is providing an opportunity for that kind of spillover of parking to accommodate that growth more flexibly.
Absolutely. And that's a fundamental part of the concept. And what we hope to do, well, not hope, but what we're going to do is work with our parking management folks and take some of the lessons that have been learned from the Whitaker area and apply those in a more proactive way to South Willamette, to say, well, as changes happen and as needs parking needs change in the district over time. Here are the different things that we can do. Here are some sites identified that we could consider for the very thing that you're talking about.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Mills.
Yeah, in one of the earlier workshops, this being like, I want to say 2 years ago that I attended when Patricia was still facilitating them, there were some layouts that I believe showed some, I'm going to use the word community or shared parking off of Willamette. And at that point, it was shown as surface parking that, available at that time to provide, to try to provide parking. But it was also, we were also talking at that time about some kind of structure, although that was seen as, prohibitively expensive. But the surface parking, at least as an interim, transitional solution, could possibly happen. There are some places you could put in some surface parking as a transitional mode to help the community and the businesses with their lost parking spaces. So, to me, that's one of the things that does need to continue to be looked at, and it might, like I said, it might just be a surface parking lot off of Willamette that people can utilize to go to the businesses in the area.
And the cap on parking might be something to consider around that, whether that's a good idea, because if a business did want to, or if someone did want to redevelop and provide additional parking, for example, to be able to serve uses around that cap might be something that could get in the way of that.
Yeah.
We'll let you continue.
Okay, great. So I also wanted to point out that, of course, you all got a copy of the preliminary workshop reports and have had a chance to peruse those. And for anyone watching, these are going to be loaded up online here pretty soon. We still have some comments that are coming in on the online questionnaire, and so eventually we'll want to incorporate that. But as you've seen, there's a really detailed description of the kind of conversations that we had at those events and what the questions were, what the responses were. So, looking at the community workshop,
Okay, sorry, I didn't know if you were going to go to meeting 2 or you did them together. Okay.
Oh, yeah, that was just kind of a
All
combined.
right. I had a question on meeting 2, and
Sure.
and with Gabe here, maybe he can answer how they'll address it. Because I was a little confused, and it was right on page 6. And when they talked about vagrancy being that if they develop or utilize for their restaurant that 15-foot space for whatever, tables, this, that, and we have the big walking thing, and they said that they had problems that it's public space, so how do you keep people from just sitting there even though it's their business that did this? Mm-hmm. And the response was that the policies that are available downtown will be applied to the South Willamette area. Well, when I read that, apparently those policies aren't working because it's an issue in the downtown. So I guess my question was, how is that or could that be addressed? And Gabe, if that's an issue also in where we're going to be having the riverfront with a lot of public space.
Well, I think the eWeb example, at least we have the opportunity to further refine that through partnerships, whether it ends up being, city park or not. We have that public space along the river where the city would have perhaps a different or larger role, potentially eWeb or future developer. Here, I think the question's a little more complicated in terms of the number of different ownerships. In terms of that continuity, I'm not sure. It's a difficult question to answer. At least at this point, I don't know, Robin, how much has really been discussed. In terms of a code requirement, that's really more of a behavioral issue than it is something you could establish standards in a special area zone for. So I think it's important in terms of that public realm and the kind of activity we want to see, but how we manage it, that's a larger question.
Our focus really is on trying to craft a code that will allow the kind of environment where we would even have to consider that as an issue in the first place. Yeah.
Commissioner Taylor.
Is there anything special, any agreements in place, like for Ambrosia or for Xenon when it was open? Because that is obviously dining area right on the public realm.
Well, I can't speak to the specific example, but I know in a variety of instances we issue what's known as a revocable right-of-way permit. It may be, for a variety of different kind of physical improvements that are essentially privately owned. I think there, in some cases, is some reluctance on the part of business owners to, enter into that because they don't have the right in perpetuity, so to speak, that they can have that physical space and manage it. But I would think, much like EWEB and some of these other special area zones, as we look at the public realm and what an adjacent business can count on in terms of either availability of parking or the physical space in front of the use, that's a really important factor. It's one that we are enabling more and more in terms of code requirements, whether it's awnings or projections into the right-of-way or cafes or other public spaces. I think, again, that's a kind of a bigger question in terms of the partnership or the, what's the regulatory relationship versus an opportunity or flexibility for an owner to use it and rely on it.
I think, too, from my perspective, the key in all of that is balancing the, let's say, the desire of the businesses to expand out into the sidewalk and really achieve that public realm that we're wanting to achieve with the public's right to just hang out on public property, and how that all plays out. And I know, Gabe, you were saying that's a difficult thing to really fine tune, because there is that public right to be in the public right of way, but yet if I was a business owner with let's say Ambrosia with tables, and somebody just wanted to park at one of my tables and just sit there and not pay for food at my business, I would have a struggle with that, even with a revocable permit. And so I think that's the balance that's the challenge for us. Commissioner Jaworski.
Yeah, one more. So,
okay.
On page 7, there was a question on estimates and timeline, and it says that in the next 20 years, it's estimated that 250 new homes will be built. I guess I'm looking at terminology on new homes. Did it just mean homes, such as not including apartment units? Or what was meant by that?
Let's see.
First top line.
Multifamily homes built in the district. It should say multifamily homes over the next 20 years through redevelopment. So
250 units?
250 units.
Is that bedrooms?
250 units. Now that would be units.
Dwelling units.
Dwelling units, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, folks have asked the question a lot. Well, what kind of change can we expect here? And our estimates based on the economics of the district, that sort of thing, the availability of property, which it's really developed currently, so it would all have to occur through redevelopment. And the estimate is that there won't be much of that happening, and that 250 units would actually presuppose some kind of an incentive.
Well, and looking at those timelines and listening to Commissioner Taylor and Mills, I agree with the need for additional parking, getting back to that issue, and it would seem to me that would be triggered, and it might not be till 10 years out that this redevelopment occurs, and you might look at parking space and or garage if warranted. Okay, good.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I had a question on that too, because one thing that sometimes is unclear is some of the information applies to the corridor, and some of it applies to the surrounding single-family option. Where we're planning on changing to several row houses along 20. So this kind of estimate, is that the estimate that we're expecting that would be happening? Is that 90% on the corridor, or 50%, or 20%? In other words, are these estimates based on, where's the development happening? It could actually be happening all around and none on the corridor, for example. That's what I'm trying to get a feel for.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at the report on that. It really is a function of the improvement value of existing properties, the size and configuration of the properties, that sort of thing. I'd have to go back and look at the specifics of the study.
Okay.
But in general, the study is not intended to predict any particular site, whether or not that's going to redevelop. It really works more in aggregate. But we can look at that further if we want to.
The reason I want to flag that is obviously our goal is really, our primary goal is getting development on the corridor. I mean, that's really, stuff around the side is useful, but really want to. And so if it turns out that right now it looks like we're going to get all the development around the single-family options, we might want to revisit some of these things to make certain that we make it more attractive to get the development on the corridor, because that's really our goal.
Well, it sounds like you're defining the corridor as being right along Willamette Street itself.
Right.
And,
Within within a block of, in other words,
yeah, and I think that
the half block behind, the stuff. But the point is, in the area that we consider that important corridor.
when we first talked about with the Community Resource Group and Envision Eugene about looking at corridor planning as a strategy, that question came up about what is a corridor lot, and most communities define that not as just the street, but within 2 to 3 blocks of that street. It really depends on what's going on in the neighborhood,
Well,
where those logical transitions occur.
Portland only defines it to be literally within, that block, half a block away. So for their transportation
Yeah.
planning and their
I don't know how they define it.
yeah, they define it quite narrowly.
Commissioner Borofsky.
Yeah. I guess just my overall, if we're just looking at the business owners meeting, what it boiled down to is their concern was parking, and that is a valid concern. And it's kind of like what we talked about with the garages, we're going to someplace, and are we there yet? No, we're not there yet. How do we get there? In 20 years, is the need for parking going to be as great as they believe it is? We don't know that right now. We can guess. So I think that is an area that we need to just be aware of and do as much as we can to try and placate and make sure that we have that balance of enough for what's going on now and where we're going. And I think that's an area that we need to look into incentives and find how we can incentivize parking. Whether that is, because to be honest with you, yeah, it sounds great the city should put a parking lot in. There's not an ability for this city to build parking structures anymore, I don't think, unless there would be a big grant or whatever. The parking fund as it is being siphoned off to pay for this building and other things in the general fund, and its repair and maintenance are getting into backlog already. So I think if there's a way that we can look into incentivizing people to build structured parking, perhaps there's a property tax. We're doing MUPTI for we're talking about doing MUPTI for multifamily housing. Well, perhaps there's a 10-year property tax incentive if you build a structured parking lot and make it private parking, or something in that area. Now, statute-wise, I don't know if that's something that even can be done, but I would hope that we would look into those types of things where if you are redeveloping and there's already talk about it. If you're redeveloping and putting parking in, there might be incentives for it. Maybe even standalone, because if you could make it pencil out that Capella's wants to build bigger, and they're going to build their whole thing, and they buy the lot next to them and put a structured parking lot there that is private, and they get to pay for, their customers get to use it free, but the other neighbors might, maybe it can pencil out if it was property tax incentivized. So I would hope that we can look into the statutory parts of that as far as being able to give away property tax, because I know it's not all. You can't just say, oh, we're going to waive it. It would have to be something maybe even done at the state level, but that's something I think needs to be looked into.
I have Commissioner Taylor, and then I think I'm going to
Yeah.
let you move on to the next community workshop.
Yeah. Thanks for spending time on this, because I actually think it's, from a larger perspective, one of the bigger items that, in order to, is a big component to success. So I agree with Commissioner Borofsky. I also think that there's some interesting dynamics, which I know downtown is a really good example. We had paid surplus parking. Well, what's happened is we've actually made a lot of the parking spaces free on the weekends to incentivize people coming downtown using the retail commercial areas. So essentially, we've got Willamette. We could run into the same situation. So if we're incentivizing private parking and they can pay for additional users, once again, I think that's farther down the line. So really looking at what this temporary situation is in allowing, I'd love to even have a surface parking where we're actually, from a public position, we're looking at reserving a lot for surface parking now, with the capacity for growth, to just secure that before that option is no longer available. Because I think if we're really talking about a walking community, if you look at a lot of examples, there's public parking lots, similar to a mall, and I know that was an example, where you have an ability to park and get out and walk to your destinations. Well, if you don't have that, is it going to be as successful? I mean, there's that question. And what I'd like to do is facilitate success, if we can. The other is, like Gabe had said, really look at the ability. Maybe there's certain properties that can develop parking not associated with the primary use on the development site. And you just reserve that. Maybe they are private parking lots, and they are paid, or you negotiate at that time, so it's a private-public partnership. There's a lot of options. I just would encourage us to maintain this dialogue of looking, especially the intensity and the allowance for actually reducing parking. Because if people start taking advantage of it and we're stuck, then, yeah.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay.
Okay. Community workshop?
All right.
That's where you were headed next?
Yeah, community workshop. So, again, this was, we sometimes call this the mega workshop. It was a 3-hour event. Commissioner Mills joined us, which was great. And we basically had 2 parts to this event, and we covered 3 topics in each one of the parts. We had a presentation on, for example, part 1 included use and height, some design standards, and also the street design standards. And then part 2 included transitions, flexibility and incentives, and single-family options. And following each one of the presentations, we had a session where tables got together and had a discussion, and then were asked to write down their comments, but also come up with questions. And then after they'd had a chance to discuss it, we went around to the different tables and answered questions, and we called it Stump the Planner. And it worked out pretty well. So there were a lot of really good questions asked and answered. And that discussion, again, is captured in the workshop report. I'll skip over some of the highlights here. So again, just based on the participants, we're not sure exactly how many people were there because not all folks signed in. I think there were about 19 or 20 questionnaires that were actually turned in at the event. We expect over time there will be many more that come in online. There is a brief presentation online that covers similar material in sort of an abbreviated way. But just to get kind of a snapshot of where people who are attending are on some of these issues, we looked at use and whether they're in the right locations that make sense for a walkable district. The responses go from absolutely, mostly, somewhat, to not at all down below. So generally, pretty favorable. As far as apartments and condos, a little more mix, kind of across the board there, but generally some favor there. Single-family options and single-family options, row houses allowed, mostly and absolutely, or most of the responses there, so that looked pretty favorable. Some of the questions, a couple of specific questions there regarding that particular use. The height. So one of the reasons that we're bringing up height is, we did talk about height a lot already in the concept plan. And the idea was that we spend time talking about the proper size and configuration of buildings through the concept plan, and we interpret that and translate that into code. And so that is what we're doing. However, when we talk about height in terms of stories with the community through the concept plan, the question comes up, well, what's a story? And so what we did at this event is we presented some diagrams that showed what an actual story is, and those reflect the conversations that we've had here already for the heights for the various sub-districts. Generally, that there were some questions about this, and I wanted to point out one of these, and I think it's in here somewhere. There is a specific area of concern, and this has to do with, actually, let me get out of this for 1 second so that I can show you. Let's see. I believe it's height map standards final. Here we go. Okay. So there's this location right up here. It's basically between 22nd and 24th Street on the west side of Willamette. This area is currently zoned. I believe it's
R2, I think.
I think it's R3 actually, so it's up to 50 feet, the height in that area. And what we're proposing here is a 5-story right along Willamette Street, and it steps down with a 75-foot step back to 3 stories at the back edge of those properties. And these properties here that are abutting the neighborhood are also 3 stories maximum. And the height limit for the 5-story would be 65 feet. Currently, there's a 50-foot height limit, and I think the height limits in previous code were geared towards a little different construction type. Stories weren't necessarily as tall as is typically constructed today, and so the new height standards are based on current construction methods with a 9-foot ceiling with greater insulation and with a higher first floor that's more conducive to if you wanted to provide a mixed use or some other kind of use in there. So that's the proposal there, and there's some concern that in these 2 blocks up here that's too high, and mostly it's folks that are living back here that are concerned about the 5 stories blocking the view.
And solar.
And solar that
Practice, too.
that if the sun is coming up, from the east, that these stories would block that eastern sun. So I wanted to point that out and make sure that you're all aware of that. Some of the other comments, let's see here. Let me get this going again. Some of the other comments had to do with other folks like the flexibility of allowing more height for public space. Others were concerned about it. So kind of a mixed bag there. There were still some folks, as they've been saying for quite a while, that heights should be lower. Other folks are saying that heights are not high enough to do certain kinds of uses.
Did you want to jump in, Commissioner Borowski, or you want to wait?
I think it's important that we, when we have these workshops, and we have people that are actually living and in this neighborhood, that we give some good weight to that. I mean, I thought, when I was looking at that map, things made sense, right, at 5. But then after reading the comments and thinking about it and going, perhaps maybe we transition not only this way, but as you're coming into the district, too. As you're coming down Willamette Street to go from, R1 and 30 feet to 65 feet, bam, maybe it should be, pyramid shaped all the way around, not just on the end. So I really hope that we give some weight to what these people are saying that are actually living in that neighborhood, know the topography, know how the sun sets and those types of things. Because, again, as I looked at the maps and stuff, I thought, okay, yeah, we got 5 stories along there, but, it's not one size fit all. And so I really want us to be able to listen to these people, and if it's possible, without jeopardizing what we're trying to achieve, take those into consideration.
I have Commissioner Jaworski, Mills, then Taylor.
Yeah, in following up on the height and the flexibility with public space, when I saw there was some pros and cons from both of them there, so it's like a mixed use, it was still unclear with me, and I just don't remember, if we wanted to have additional height and we put in public space, if I remember the examples, it seemed like the public space always shown was like on the ground floor, there was something there. Can you also put in public space within the building and have it count? Because I think that would get the community to give a different opinion what they think of height. If they think they're getting something on the ground that's treed that they can walk around, and if you're also eligible to say, well, on the 6th floor, I'm going to have this big public area.
It's public open space, so we're not talking about something under the interior. It would be exterior, outdoor, public open space.
Okay, because I know when you do a PUD and you talk about open space, it can be interior, it can be out, because I know that they've done that on developments. That's why I asked that question.
And I think this is an example where, because we're creating a special area zone, we have the opportunity to customize it and specifically set the standard for open space. I mean, similar to the discussion we had in eWeb, and there are some options there that we can perhaps move away from some of those existing standards and make them more specific where appropriate.
Okay. Then I think it would be clearer if it said it's external public open space. Then, thank you.
I think it was then Commissioner Mills, then Taylor, then Baker. I'm going to start writing this down.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in. I was at the meeting, and some of the things that I heard, so I'll get them out for the other commissioners. In addition, basically, this is a very good summary, so I'm not trying to counter this at all, but I would say that solar was a repeated concern that was raised, particularly in hilly areas where people might be on the uphill side of a new tall building that would restrict their morning light, and their afternoon light was already restricted. So there was some concerns in this neighborhood where there were hills and R1 homes in back of the corridor that they might lose some light. And they spent a lot of time trying to understand, well, if it's on a hill, where does the story count start, at the lower level or at the upper level? And I think that question was answered. But solar was a big issue. Parking was, again, a concern. The setback at the street, in other words, we talked about the setback, and that was a very, I'd say, strong, where the building, the first story, I'm going to get the wrong terminology.
No, step back.
Step back at the upper story, okay,
Yeah.
get the right terminology
Yeah,
here. Was very strongly accepted by that group. They wanted that. And then that was kind of discussed in light of the test drive that we had, where that was a little bit of a challenge, but they were very adamant. I think the group of people that heard it and understand it, that they liked the idea of the upper story step back to try to improve the light. And there was some talk from one person about, well, I'll just use the term transitions and some upzoning, or were some things that were, people were seeing, oh, geez, well, here where I'm at, all of a sudden there's this possibility, this big thing right across the street from me. And so there were people that were seeing that, geez, where I'm living right now, things, what is allowed to be around me, I'm not sure how much it's really changing, but the change was being perceived that, oh my gosh, now I can have all of this stuff, this bigger stuff around me. And I'm not sure how much of that was real. In other words, they were already in the zone, it just wasn't built. Mm-hmm. And how much of it was, not real. I mean, not real, but future, we'll say. Mm-hmm. And I also want to add that I thought the meeting was very well handled by staff. There was a number of staff. Robin didn't mention, but I think there was like 6 staff there too to help with eyes and ears and answer various questions. So,
Mr. Taylor.
Yes, a question for staff. So the property between 22nd and 24th, can you just confirm? You said it's currently zoned on the west side of the street. It's currently zoned R3. I know right now it's showing the plan designation is limited high density residential.
Let me show you. This map here, we have the existing zoning right here. All these properties, all the way up to the back is R3.
Yeah, it's R3, great.
And so, again, what we're proposing is that they would be apartment condo,
Yeah,
but the height regulation would be that they would go 5 and then step down to 3 on both of those sections of property. And so we'd been hearing these concerns
Yeah.
early on in the concept plan, and through the concept plan, that was the response, is to say, okay, at least 75 feet away from that alley or property edge, whichever one it is.
Yeah.
And I think in both of these situations, it's actually an alley. In this case, the properties are large enough that you can just set the height for those particular properties. These properties extend all the way through,
Yeah.
and so we set that 75-foot setback.
The reason why I'm bringing that up is if this is a particular area of concern, so really what we're talking about for the 5 stories, a 15-foot difference is what I'm hearing, because you have R3 is 50 feet, which is existing. So they purchased their property or they've been living there, whether they knew it or not, it's R3. So we're talking about a 15-foot difference. So actually the step backs are actually allowing them more transition than prior. So really, because when I read through it, it did seem, and correct me if I'm wrong, it did seem like this was the particular area of concern by neighbors, the 22nd to 24th on the western side.
It is.
So to some degree, 15 feet, I'd almost say, if it's such a significant issue, leave it at 50 feet and reduce the step backs so that you still get some density, but you don't have the step backs. So really, it's discussing with neighbors that are impacted, that are concerned and involved, to really understand it. Because, is that 15 feet really going to get them or alleviate the eastern sun that they're talking about?
Yeah,
because it would have been 50 anyways.
And we have had some conversations with the folks that are concerned about that, and even done some looks at some modeling to see what that would look like. I think the concern is really that buildings of any height.
Yeah. That's what I'm kind of hearing.
Yeah, I asked specifically at the workshop, well, if 5 stories is too much, what would you suggest? And I think the suggestion was 1 to 2 at the table, and in the comments I think I saw 2 to 3 stories listed. So I think that's what they're asking for in that location.
Yeah, in terms of Commissioner Borowski, though, I do think if this is where the predominant feedback, just to identify that we're listening, I guess I'd really want to understand, because personally, I'm not open to going below R3. I think it's there. It's an existing zone. I think it fits in with the larger plan that you've been working on. So it's just having that discussion with the owners, because I think there might be, for me anyways, I'm open to listening to various options at the 50-foot height. I mean, because 15 feet to me is like, well, first, is it going to get them what they want? It sounds like it isn't. So 5 feet with a wonderful step back that gets it to closer to 3 stories might actually accommodate their needs. But it's really saying, okay, we understand, we want to hear more, and know that R3 50 feet is what it is.
Yeah, so if we did that, for example, craft a special height regulation for that one little area. So currently with the 5 stories, we're looking at the 65-foot height because it accommodates the allowed floor space. If you were to say, well, let's go down to 50 feet, depending on what kind of construction you did with the building, obviously, you may or may not be able to get 5 stories out of that. And so maybe that's okay. Yeah,
it's more about the really responding to public comment.
Sure.
So it's basically medium in the middle, saying, okay, we understand your concerns. There's already an R3, so we're not really willing to compromise below 50 feet. So maybe once they understand that they're not going to get a 1 to 2 story building, maybe the extra 15 feet and then a step back is really viable.
Well, I guess maybe what I would recommend, at this point it would probably be helpful to have some kind of just concrete suggestions to play off of.
Okay.
And I think that if the existing zoning is 50 feet, the proposed height limit, I believe, for the 3 stories is 45. So if that were to be just 3 stories along there for those 2 blocks, I think that would be less than 50 feet, which is more restrictive than current code. And then you add in the transition standards, that obviously don't exist in current code. It would be more restrictive, but
Yeah.
it would address the question.
Yeah.
And it would reduce complexity, I think, in terms of the concepts that are already discussed in
Yeah,
the plan.
Yeah,
and
the
in terms
fewer
of using
exceptions
rather than having
Yeah.
to craft a
Special
special
things
that you do,
the better.
standard
I
for
agree.
that one little zone. Yeah.
And I understand that. I just am very sensitive to what Commissioner Borowski's saying, is that if we've got a larger population that's showing up and this is their area of concern, I guess I can even take initiative with a planning commissioner to actually forward that conversation at our planning commission open house.
Yeah, or you can just make the suggestion right now if you want to.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we're here, is to discuss any kind of.
Go for it.
Okay, I would suggest but once again, I don't know, are we talking about 2 owners?
Yeah.
So I guess I don't understand because there were 19 questionnaires, about 40 people present. So really, what are we talking about? 2 property owners? So I want to understand who's concerned, the quantity of the people concerned, and if it's valid to continue this conversation, to have some kind of variation. My preference is consistency. I think it will be better in the long run. At the same time, if this is a true concern by a larger population, I would like to know that.
So far, it's been a couple of folks that have been in contact and been present at the events. But of course, they have talked about having conversations with their neighbors and friends who feel similarly. But it's hard to tell without, So,
Have Commissioner Baker, then Commissioner Jaworski.
Yep.
And I think we'll let you wrap it up. I think it's good to get the interaction and the discussion as we go through, though. So,
Yeah, I think it makes sense to treat it a little differently, not treat it the way the rest of the corridor is because of its location. A couple of things that haven't been mentioned is it's steep there compared to when we get past 24th, it flattens out. Okay, so we're and also the road is right now, the access is not very good in that area. In other words, a lot of the traffic on 24th either comes in from the south end and exits, or it comes in on Amazon and comes over on 24th and comes onto the corridor. There's a certain amount that comes on Willamette, but it's limited because Willamette is such a, it's 2 lanes there. It's not 4. This doesn't even have a mid-lane turn lane. So I think it makes sense to treat those 2 blocks a little differently because of the location, also because it's zoned R3. And I don't know, I would defer to staff if you wanted to say a maximum of 4 stories, but a height limit of 50. But if you don't want to introduce height limits, then use your 3-story example, if that would be the best way to deal with it. I think it makes sense to treat it a little differently, given that it is R3. The other stuff up here is C2. It has 120-foot height, so we're not restricting it. And you probably, I don't know how many owners involved. It would be up to the owners, if they want to really build. The reality is if you build 3-story buildings, you don't have to put in an elevator normally. Obviously, as soon as you go to 4 stories, that's a different beast. It's, at least so far, traditionally in Eugene, it's not like Hoboken where you can get a 5-story walk-up for, 2 apartments. But construction costs would be less without an elevator. But you could propose it to the property owners to see what they feel more comfortable with. A limitation of 4 stories and 50 feet, or if you wanted to keep it all consistent and have it by stories, then this area is 3 stories, and you can eliminate the step backs or whatever if you do that, maybe, or minimize them. That's my thought, mainly because I really think that access is much more challenging there anyway. The idea of trying to turn into those areas off of going north is really not a very friendly situation. And then also we have this site down here at the bottom on the east side, which may very well become, quite congested depending on the change of use that might occur there. So those are my thoughts. I mean,
Commissioner Jaworski.
Yeah, I guess I'm in agreement with a lot that has been said. I'd like to know the number of owners, so it isn't a single one or two people that are concerned with this, that it's something that affects them all. Number two, if there was something on the height restrictions, if we went to that suggestion, I would then like to have a discussion on what does this mean on flexibility. This area has to have something different written so that they provide open space, they don't get extra stories. All of that would be somewhat of a mess.
Yeah.
And then the third thing on just height in general, and I'm sure that can be done easily. I have solar, and I also have a building that's 30-some feet high, and I have one-story homes around me. Solar doesn't go east; it goes south, and morning sun, by what the guys told me, is not really where you get it. You have to wait until it gets up here. So I don't know really what kind of an impact this would have. I've looked out my third story a lot to the one-story homes, and there's never, I don't think ever, a shadow on the roof, and maybe an extra 15 or 20 feet there might be, but it wouldn't be for long. So I think that, if this was to become an issue that we want to change, I would want more information on someone giving me the angles of what's happening there so I really know what we're talking about as far as its impact. Thank you.
Okay.
I have myself in the queue, and then Commissioner Baker. Then I think I really will let you finish. And I guess what I'm hearing is, it seems to me worth either looking at or suggesting that the 5-story designation on the west side of Willamette from 24th North be changed to 3-story.
And what we can do is bring back a little more information
Yeah.
and add that to the list as a suggestion.
Yeah.
I think I'll just jump out there and suggest that. Okay, I've got Commissioner Baker and then Mills and Borowski.
Yeah, just a quick thing, since I'm sort of the solar energy person here. What you're concerned about is a window from about 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., so about 6 hours. So we're looking at, and it varies from month to month, but it's about 15 degrees for each hour. So we're looking at about a 45-degree east to 45-degree west. So it's not due south, but there is a window there, that you could apply, and you could see there would be cases where where you would be impacting a device if you blocked it during those, because again the sun is only due south exactly at solar noon, and most of the time it's not due south. It's
Right.
some other angle. So.
Yes, Mills, then
Yeah.
Borowski.
I guess I wanted to expand a little bit on what I heard on solar. It wasn't strictly an energy-related discussion. It was a health and psyche-related discussion. I'd also offer that it's a structural discussion, and my experience with living in places with limited sun is one of the things you want to have most on your home is you want your home to see daylight during the part of the day. It's important for the health of the structure to do that. And what I was hearing from some of the folks, and I want to say a little bit about that, was they were concerned that all of a sudden they've already got limited afternoon sun in some cases, and they could face some limitation of morning sun. And I guess I heard that, and that would be a concern that I would have. And having said that, even if there is only one or two people that mentions this, to me, I think we still have to hear this, and we have to ask ourselves, is this a viable concern? If one person mentions it, I mean, there's probably a line of people behind them that weren't at the meeting that would have the same concern. And I think that's one of our responsibilities, to hear that concern and decide how viable, how big a concern it is, even if only one person mentions it.
Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, and so I just pulled it up on Google Street View, and the topography is part of this conversation. Right now, there's multifamily there that's 2-story, but if you look at it's on a berm that's up at least a story. Mm-hmm. So right now you've got a 2-story multifamily, but it's above the grade of Willamette Street. It's probably 50 feet, probably. So if you're talking about where you're going to put that where they start their grade, 65 feet is a significant concern. And like Kristen says, yeah, that's what they can do now, but for the people who are behind that, I think it is a real concern. And so I think that maybe it's 65 feet from the again, not wanting to recraft language, but from Willamette Street, because it's a big hill. I don't know. I just don't know. But I do see their concerns, and like I said, I know that those people living in that area. So,
Robin and Gabe, back to you.
All right. So moving right along, that I think was a lot of the crux of the height discussion. There's a few other varying comments in there. That was one of the most prominent ones. Looking at building design standards, I think there was generally quite a bit of understanding and support for that. Looking at, let's see, that was mixed-use apartment condos. Here's another question. Was specifically regarding articulation and architectural detail to promote a better pedestrian experience. A lot of support for that. The special setbacks along the street, most folks were definitely in favor of doing this, given that it's necessary to realize the vision. Additional comments along the setback, some appreciation for the flexibility it would give for creating that environment. Some concern about the on-street parking. There are some folks who have been asking about how that works with bike lanes. We responded to those questions. And then some folks wanting to see it happen sooner. And also some questions, as we brought up just a minute ago, about the slope and how that would work. If you have buildings built above the slope, how does that create a great pedestrian environment? And I think the way that we answered that is, you would actually build into the slope, and so you'd have the ground floor of the building at the street level, and build in. It's done in many other conditions and locations. Community workshop. So talking about transitions here. I think most folks felt like that was going to work. There were some questions about whether or not the 10-foot setback would be enough room to plant small trees as a screen. And I think one of the participants, who's a landscaper, suggested that it would not be, and suggested more room or not allowing the trees. There was some concern about if neighbors didn't want to have the trees, what are we going to do with that? And we responded that, well, we do have a provision for folks to be able to opt out as a neighbor of that requirement. Flexibility and incentives. I think this area there was probably least understanding about what it was and how it worked. And this had to do with the flexibility between, this was parking flexibility. And these, again, raised the parking questions that we've heard quite a bit already. And flexibility incentives, this had to do with providing amenities like open space. So this is the flexibility with the parking at open space. And I think some people thought that was a really good idea. Other people weren't so sure, and partly because of the additional height. Flexibility and incentives, again, here are the quotes from the comments. Let's see here. Again, more comments about evaluating existing parking and what would it require. Some folks saying don't require too much parking, and that you can get more density without the height if you don't require that. Some comments about height. And one comment that the parking tied to the number of bedrooms would be excessive. Single-family options, quite a bit of support for that. Both in terms of the development types and the design standards applied to those. In terms of important concepts that we're missing, this is a question that John Belcher, Commissioner Belcher, former, had brought up a number of times about the uses. And even though it may be mixed use, is there something next door that's not going to be compatible in terms of noise and whatnot? Question about the slope. Another comment about 3 stories, step back, even, we talked about that one, even if it reduces the developability. Concern about height bonuses, making room for a cycle track, which if you have an incremental development of the street edge, you would not be able to do a cycle track yet, but in the long-term, distant future, you may have that option. But of course, you won't unless you have the additional right-of-way. So that's generally it. There were some comments about the street, of course, the 4-lane configuration preference there. Let's see, more comments about height and parking. And then a variety of general comments. Yes?
Real quick question, back on the previous slide, it said something about camping. I was there, I don't remember anything about camping.
Yeah, this comment has come up a couple of times, and it has to do with folks looking for an opportunity to do, I think it was recreational camping. I'm not quite sure. I'd have to look at that again, but that question has come up. So again, comments that reflect most of what we've talked about already. There's a concern that the meeting wasn't documented, written notes and taped and that sort of thing. And it's a good comment. Typically, we do record comments at the events. We ask folks to write down their comments as much as possible and share the responsibility for providing that information. We also had staff taking notes, and we've tried to do a good job of reflecting all the different comments and concerns we've heard. So I think that's it. I think we've covered most of the content of the outreach to date.
Thank you. Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I got out of the presentation and out of the packet kind of goes to that last bullet point about it being a done deal, and when I was looking at the surveys, the questions were written in a way, to me, almost a push type of a question. I think that, would the proposed design standards help do an active street community? Well, most people are going to say yes on that kind of thing. A lot of them, the question was written to get it. It felt to me the question was written to get the response that we wanted. And I, ones that were a little bit more open for the people to actually interpret. The numbers were more balanced, it seemed to me. So I don't want it to feel like it's a done deal. When we do a community workshop like this, I don't want it to be we went out and engaged the community and listened to them, and here's what we're going to go and do. I've seen that happen in the city in other areas, where you hold a public hearing and then go ahead and do everything, and listen, and 50 people show up and talk about something, and then you go ahead and do what you want to do. So I think it's real important that when we have these types of things, if there is legitimate concerns, that we as a commission listen to those and try and implement those, so that we can, take it from this is our community vision to this is an implementable process, and work those people's things in there, not just take, we heard what the community wanted, and our planners did a great job of planning something that fits that goal. Because my concern is, again, and we've seen it happen before, is we build a nice package, we put something together, we do 20 meetings at Planning Commission to get it ready, and then when it gets to City Council, the property owners are going to stand up there and they're going to say, this is wrong, and one of the city councilors is going to change it on the fly. So I think we need to try and get the buy-in from as many people as we can at this stage, so that they're not standing up there in the public forum saying, you got this wrong. And that's all that council hears. I don't think it's a done deal. I think that this is exactly what you guys are doing here, but that's what I want to make sure, that we get it as much vetted out as we can at this level, because that's what we are. In my opinion, the Planning Commission is the citizen's voice. So that's just where I'm leaning.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. That makes a lot of sense. In terms of the phrasing of the questions, one thing we've tried to emphasize is that we're not starting from zero, and that we did spend 3 years talking about what kind of a concept, what is the vision, and what should that vision be, and looking actually in quite a bit of detail about, where should the height go and where should it not go, and did a lot of weighing and balancing of that at that time. And so part of the phrasing of the question is our job here is to implement that vision. And so we're asking questions that say, is what we're doing here consistent with that vision that we've been asked to provide? And the intent certainly is not to lead anybody to a particular conclusion, and that's why we have a section to provide comments and explain that. And is there anything missing? Is there anything that you feel should be changed? Those are all really important comments, because we do obviously want people's input. And what we're looking for are a couple of different things. One is, what does the commission need to know that you don't already know? Like, what issues and concerns are out there that we have not addressed yet? And certainly throughout this process, in many, many different ways, we have addressed a huge host of different issues and concerns. And so we're trying to thread the needle of very disparate opinions about, do this, and what's the right balance of those that's consistent with the vision of doing what the council's asked us to do. So that's a really good point. And we also try to remind folks that, no, this absolutely is not a done deal. And I'm not sure what we can do to reduce that. I guess it's kind of a cynical view of government and what we do. And I think being transparent and being consistent is really important, because we also have to remember that there are folks out there who participated in the vision who are expecting it to happen. And part of being consistent is being consistent in supporting that as well. So
I have myself in the queue, and then Commissioner Taylor. Couple of thoughts that I have with the phrasing of questions. Generally, I have found that asking questions such as what do you think, or how do you feel about something, will elicit maybe I don't know if it's a broader response, but maybe less that it's a done deal. And so in the future, as questions are phrased, maybe consider, doing it in the context of, what do you think of this, or how do you feel about this? And maybe leaving that a little bit more open that way might have less of the sense that maybe it's a done deal. Just a suggestion. Commissioner Taylor.
I just wanted to echo what Commissioner Mills and Commissioner Borofsky has said, and thank you for your clarification too. And just I agree that even if it's one person, for instance, that said this isn't transparent, I would really want to understand why and know. So because I do want it to be successful, and our efforts, as well as the community's efforts up until this point, when we bring it to council, that we've done our work. So in relation to that comment, I think it's important that if it's already a done deal, that's a pretty significant comment. So just to understand where that's coming from, so that we can potentially address that in proposing our recommendations to City Council.
Mm-hmm.
If there was this comment made by X,
Mm-hmm.
so that there's a recognition that we've honored that and we've listened to it. And I think it's the same between 22nd and 24th, and that's why I brought it up in particular. And if there is one voice to differentiate, like what Commissioner Mills has said, I do believe it's R3 now. So I'm not personally a proponent of bringing it down to R2, R1. I think this is an excellent corridor for density. It's already been projected as density. So that's why I really want to understand what is the true impact between 22nd and 24th. Because I think maintaining the 50-foot, I personally don't have a problem with that if it is really a challenge. And there are slope issues. I mean, there are some, so that said, the other piece is that I also heard a lot of feedback between heights and stories. And I actually understand that from a property owner perspective, because there can be a huge variable between the two. So I would like to recommend at least a maximum height. So if stories is going to be vocabulary, and we talked about this with Walnut Mixed Use Station, I know you've addressed that, but that's a pretty significant concern that I think if it isn't being vocalized, it will be. So just making sure that we're really clear what those maximum heights are.
And that was, I just want to add really quick that is, we shared these diagrams.
Yeah.
And these illustrate very clearly what the maximum height is for each one of these stories. For example, for 3 stories, it's 45 feet.
Yeah,
For
exactly.
5 stories,
And I know
it's
you're doing that just to make sure that it's in language in the code.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are actually the diagrams we're proposing to put
insert.
to put into the code. Yep.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to one of the comments, too, about it. We talked about 22nd and 24th, but there's another area here along 29th, which is essentially we're upzoning from R1 to essentially R3. And again, I think what makes sense is because of the nature of the plan, there's certain areas that we may want to treat a little differently. So I have to agree with them that we probably shouldn't allow trading open space for additional stories in that area, because now we're taking an area that was zoned R1 with a certain limited height, and then now we're saying you could put a 4-story building there depending on how you're trading. So they didn't seem to be complaining so much about the base zone, but the idea of trading open space for an extra story there might not be allowed. And that seems to be a reasonable thing, because we're taking an area that was zoned R1 and properties that are abutting R1, and all of a sudden saying now they're abutting R3. And even though we have transition zones, we do have this option to trade open space. So I think there might be some places like 22nd to 24th in here where you change things, where trading open space for additional height is not allowed, say, in that area, which would seem to be reasonable to me.
So it sounds like you're making a suggestion to limit the application of that open space for additional height exchange to only certain locations or certain uses.
Right. And, that's a good example of a place where you might want to limit it. And I don't know, maybe, maybe that applies to the 22nd and 24th. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if there are other areas like that, but that one stands out because there was, specifically a comment in the workshop about that. And there are other comments about trading open space for building height. But that one resonated with me because we have an area that traditionally has been all zoned R1, and now we're imposing this upzone on properties that, it's the adjacent property that feels the brunt, So that was an example of, cases where you might fine-tune some of the options, like the trade-off for parking, height for open space. And also I wanted to mention there was a lot of mixed response about parking reductions for open space as well. And one thing that's a challenge, I know it must be a challenge for you, but for the attendees is because we have stuff going on the corridor, but then we have stuff going on in the SFO options and, row house character apartments. In other words, to know when things apply where. In other words, an open space reduction for parking, is it clearly communicated that I assume that was only in the corridor, not on the SFO? I'm assuming that's the case, but again, I don't know for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that was specific to the mixed-use apartment condo sub-districts.
Okay, so that would include the 29th then?
It would currently, unless you want to make a different suggestion.
Well, I'll come back to parking when we talk about the standards themselves, but I'll make one comment here because I think it's important. Once you have to go to a permit system, from my point of view, it means the parking has already broken down, because the permit system does not work well for residents. Aside from the area by the arena, the permit system only applies from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So the streets can be clogged on evenings and weekends with cars. That's just the way it is. And also, it's a hardship because if you have someone trying to visit you, come for dinner, or a relative coming out from out of town, there's no place for them to park. You have to make a special effort to go get a temporary permit. If you have any repair done on your property, then you have to go and make a special effort to go to the parking office over by the U of O and get a temporary permit so that person can park during the day for more than 2 hours. So my point of view is going to a permit system means that the system has already failed. So you don't really want to have the situation where you're pushing parking into these areas and then we have to impose a permit system on them, because it's not really an ideal situation anymore. So,
just to clarify, we're not proposing a permit system at this time, just for anybody who
right,
think that,
but there's a lot of issues here about reducing parking for open space or for
just clarifying. Yeah.
For other things, which doesn't reduce the parking need. It just means it gets moved somewhere else. In other words, if a retail store needs a certain amount of parking, we can reduce their requirements to meet it themselves, but it gets handled somewhere else. And that's the problem. And the other thing is, once you've gotten to the point where you do have parking pushed out into the neighborhoods, then you have a very energy wasteful situation where people have to drive around and hunt for parking spaces, which is the worst kind of energy consumption, where you're just idling, going 5 or 10 miles an hour, driving around looking for a parking space where, in the past you just parked in front of your house or across the street.
Commissioner Taylor, then Commissioner Jaworski.
Robin, can you remind me, so with an incentive to provide additional open space and you get an extra story, there's parameters around that, right? Because I can't remember where we are, but I'm looking at the building height. So, for instance, along 29th, where Commissioner Baker's talking about, it's not, are there step backs? So remind me, what was staff's proposal at this point? I just want to better understand.
Yeah, let me see if I can dig that up.
Transition.
Let's see. Here we go. So I believe that the original proposal was up to 1 story over 15% of the site, just as kind of base flexibility for building design anomalies and whatnot. Open space was for 600 square feet or 5% of the site. You have 1 story on 30% of the site. The feedback that we'd had up to this point is that, well, that's from the architectural community, that wasn't a useful incentive unless it was a full story.
Yeah.
And there was some discussion about that. The other one was 1,500 square feet or 15% of the site. You get 1 story on 100% of the site, which of course is limited by whatever the footprint of the building is. And again, for any of these, any step back areas, setback areas would be excluded.
Okay. Okay.
So that's what the illustration shows. And then finally, for 3,000 square feet or 25% of the site, you get one story on 100% of the site and one additional story on 50% of the site. And there were a number of comments made by Planning Commission at the time we discussed that, and we haven't incorporated those into a revised proposal yet.
Okay, so that's still to be determined.
Yep.
And did you get any feedback my memory, and I did go through them pretty carefully, didn't seem like you had a lot of feedback from 29th in that area that Commissioner Baker's talking about.
Page 5, top paragraph.
Okay.
Yeah, as I look at this, it's. I think if this were to be tailored to the needs of the district,
Yeah.
it feels like these open space needs are mostly in the core of the district.
Okay.
I think there are other kinds of requirements for open space that are provided for residents, for more multifamily types of use, or even single-family types of use. In the single-family options, there's requirements for private and public,
Right.
private and common open space. This feels to me like it's more important in the core of the district. So if you
Okay.
want to have a walkable space and some kind of urban plazas, amenities, and that sort of thing that support that walkability and the vitality of the business district,
Yeah.
this is where you would do that. So one thing you might consider is whether you would want to limit this to the mixed-use areas only.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Jaworski.
Yeah, just a clarification for me. I'm looking at heights, setbacks, and new zones map, and when I look from 22nd to 24th, which was the discussion, the two yellow areas there, which are apartment condos, are on the west side 3, on the east side 5. What I'm understanding is that would all be 3, or we're thinking that it might be all 3?
Bear with me a second while I call that up.
And look at it. That's the suggestion, to make that a solid 3, both on the east and west side.
Just the west side of Willamette. That's what I suggest.
Yeah, if you look at the map,
Those two areas right there.
Right there. Would it be all 3?
Yeah. No. Just be those, not this one.
These two would be...
Yes.
That's what I'm saying. They're 3, 5, 3, 5. They would just be all 3.
That
Yeah.
was the
As a
suggestion.
suggestion.
Yeah, to look at.
And then south of 24th, they
blocks.
would remain as they are.
correct.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Easy question.
I don't know how Planning Commission works. So when there's recommendations for 3 stories, can I add another recommendation that we maintain the 50 feet? So, I mean, I'd like some more information, like Commissioner Jaworski said. But I'm just not sure how this works. Like, if that's proposed, then we vote on something very specific.
Where it's informal like this.
Yeah,
it's-
okay.
It's kind of.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just noticed that there's some
I know
lists.
from my suggestion, because I was the one
Yeah.
that suggested that, I would tend to leave it at the 45 for a couple of reasons. One is the topography, and 2, just to simplify the code and not to have this standard that, oh, well, yeah, you're the 3-story, but you get 50 feet, but these people only get 45. And that's
between this street and that street.
Yeah, and I tend to try and see if we can make things a little simpler rather than when we can.
So 3 feet and
So,
45.
3 stories, 45 feet
Commissioner
was my
Taylor?
suggestion
Yeah.
to look at.
What I might suggest in terms of the process as we
Yeah.
move forward, in terms of the working summary, we'll
Yes.
add the recommendation to change to 3-story in that area.
Yes.
We can also add the opportunity there to have more discussion about
Perfect.
an alternative to that, a more nuanced approach. But we'll put a placeholder there. We'll add it to the list as one of the items to resolve, whether it's a vote or what.
We do have
Thank you.
quite a few items to be determined in Attachment A that we won't get through today, I'm sure. So I saw a bunch of hands here, and I couldn't remember who was next. Okay, Commissioner Baker.
Just to clarify also, the height is not always measured from the lower point. It depends on the dimension between the lower point and the next point. So it's not always the lowest point sometimes, because I
If
think
there's
it's 11 feet.
if there's more than 10 feet,
10
it's,
feet, then
Right.
it's,
at least in,
yeah, in our code, yeah.
Yeah.
So just to clarify, it's not always the lowest point, which could apply in some of these areas that are steep, so.
Okay. you want to clarify that?
Oh, just to clarify, under existing code, based on the definition of building height, I believe if there's a difference of 10 feet between the lowest and highest point, you get, or I mean, it's a percentage. You get that additional 10
Use
feet
the higher point.
Yeah.
allowance. It's something that I don't know the details in terms of the proposed concept, but in an area like we're discussing here, where the slope is quite steep, it makes sense to really square off on that, deal with that question about the existing definition. I mean, that's one. Again, there could be some nuance to redefining it for such a small area, as opposed to. I mean, it may lend some weight to the idea of just limiting it to 3. As far as, again, simplicity, it's going to be a message I'll continue to bring up in our discussions. Even though we want to customize, we want, as a special area zone, we don't want to get so nuanced that we're looking at 4 or 5 lots for a subsection of code.
Right.
And I think Commissioner Taylor's concerns about the 45 to 50 feet with that 10-foot difference might be allayed because of
Yeah,
the
and
slope
we don't
in
need
those
to talk about
particular
it
areas.
this way.
But-
Consistency, I use the code all the time. Consistency is always my preference. I also want to make sure we're honoring the density that we'd like, so it's a bigger discussion.
The balance.
Yeah.
Okay. We want to start diving into attachment A.
Okay, let's go for it.
We don't have a lot of time, but we can make some progress, I think.
Yeah, we don't. Okay, I believe we left off at item, so let's see, we covered 13 and I covered 14. I believe we were on item 15. And just
In the parking areas.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, back in the parking. So the suggestion was to offset parking requirement 1-to-1 for new on-street parking spaces provided through the redevelopment. And I believe that was, the intent was to acknowledge the increased parking capacity provided by on-street spaces, especially through the long-term parking option on Willamette Street as a partial incentive for that. And I think one of the suggestions was also to potentially limit that idea just to Willamette Street. But that was my recollection.
Commissioner Borowski.
I think we're right.
So just so I'm clear on this, you're saying...
Oh, I'm sorry, that we already, my apologies, that was number 14.
Yeah.
We already decided to include that one in the proposed code. That was
Yeah.
that was a friendly, sorry.
All right,
Okay.
never mind.
My bad. Number 15. This one was do not allow parking reductions for residential uses that eliminate parking spaces. And off-site spaces and replacement reductions, okay.
Commissioner Jaworski.
First of all, I didn't even understand that writing. How do not allow parking reductions for residential uses that eliminate parking. Well, if they're eliminating parking spaces, they're already getting a reduction. I never understood what that meant. And when I talked in the context of what that means, I'd like to have you say what 21 means, because it's also talking about establishing minimum reductions. And so I got confused when I looked at those two.
Okay. I think I'll take a shot at that. I think what we're talking about here with number 15 is that in the list of options for reducing parking, some of those options would actually eliminate a parking space. So I'll take, for example, the proximity to transit. You could reduce your parking requirement by X% if you're within a certain distance from a high-capacity transit stop. So those parking spaces just wouldn't be provided at all. Another example of flexibility would be to say that you can provide your parking spaces on-site in a different location, like on the ground in a different location, like, for example, across the street, a block down the street, within a certain distance. So that means that the parking spaces actually would be there, they would exist, but it was just providing flexibility in terms of where and how they're provided. And so I think the suggestion in number 15 is that is saying, no, let's not reduce parking. Let's maintain that bottom line parking. It's just, the question is where.
Commissioner Taylor?
So does that mean that the 25% allowed reduction for all developments would not be allowed?
The way it's written.
Yep. So I don't know
You mean
how
as
this...
the right of development, the
Yeah.
25%?
So I don't know how this works. This is my first time I've done a voting. I guess I'm not a proponent of this, so...
Yeah, I
We
think so.
will take, we'll
Yeah.
take kind of a straw
Okay.
poll when
Yeah,
we
yeah. Great.
get there, so.
So part of the, I'll just for Commissioner Taylor's benefit, part of the reason we're working through it this way is because as suggestions come up, sometimes there's informal
Yeah.
discussion, and it's hard for us to tell where the commission lands. And we'll have a proposed code, and what we're trying to do is get a sense for where the commission generally wants us
Yeah.
to go.
This helps us
Makes
land.
sense. It's
It's
really
informal.
fast.
Yeah.
I just wasn't sure if somebody starts it or if you have a discussion and then you start.
I usually get it started as far as the straw poll. Are we ready to do a? I guess I see two things here: the parking reductions and then the off-site spaces as a replacement. And is that the way the rest of the commission is seeing this as far as a way to approach that, Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, just to clarify, I read this that, I read this that additional reductions, so the normal 25% we give to all developments, and if you're in a TSP, a transportation over, whatever it's called,
TOD.
yeah, you get the 50%. I didn't.
I believe this was your suggestion, so if you want to amend it.
Yeah, no, I didn't. I thought that what we were saying is additional reductions.
Okay.
So that would be open space or something else, And the whole point is we always allow space for space trade-offs traditionally for replacement, off-site, but there's an agreement. I think there's a query about that somewhere later on down the list. So it's sort of tied to the same thing that, there's a long-term agreement when you agree to substitute parking that's across the street or down. I think it's within a quarter of a mile, I think, is the requirement that we have. So again, I never assumed that this was
So it's
eliminated.
additional reductions beyond the 25%?
Yeah,
Okay.
because we have some other proposals here that would allow you to reduce the parking beyond those normal reductions.
As I understand the concept, having looked through the materials, and this is, again, similar to EWEB and other special area zones, and from a staff perspective, it's often difficult to understand the rationale around an automatic 25% reduction rather than setting the minimum where we want it.
Yeah.
And so we've taken the approach of being more specific about customizing that for particular areas. And so I'd encourage the commission to really think about those minimums and maximums as the starting point rather than trying to factor in this partial reduction off the top, and get more specific about where we want to make those reductions for things that are favorable for the district, whether it's shared parking or it's the frequency of transit or other things we want to encourage and allow a specific amount of minimum parking reductions. Those are really the areas I'd encourage you to think about, as opposed to just a percentage.
Commissioner Taylor.
So how, going back to consistency, which I do like, is that if you've got a code and the majority of the code is allowing 25% reduction and then 50% reduction if you have two or more uses, so are we saying that in this particular, I actually like that because it's used throughout the code. I mean, if there's additional reductions beyond that because of location next to a transit stop, et cetera, is something different. So what you're saying is that in certain areas, and I don't know the riverfront plan very well, that actually you're not allowed the 25% reduction, you just go to a minimum?
That's right.
You have a different parking requirement list.
That's correct. We set our own table based on the category of uses, and again, it's very simple compared to the existing code where there's 4 pages of different uses and different ratios. And to look at the EWEB example, and I think the concept here, it's really you set a basic minimum for residential and a maximum if you want, and then for non-residential, again, minimum and maximum. So you're not trying to customize it for every possible use that might come along. And again, that's the perhaps one of the beauties of a form-based code and a more flexible use list in a mixed-use district. I guess the question is, would you want to use the existing tool of 25% automatically, and then a special review or something for 50%, or do you want to get more tailored to incentivizing the things you want?
So, Gabe, what I'm hearing then is that staff is recommending starting a shift, basically, with both Riverfront and with Walnut Station and with South Willamette, from the 25 and 50% reductions as kind of this formula to shifting to just simply having minimums and maximums and then making exceptions where we might want to.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I have no problem with that, but we really have to think about, if the minimum is the 25% reduction, then we have to make sure that we understand that. I mean, when we're talking about these things, we need to know what that minimum is so we can talk intelligently about what our concerns are or whatever.
Right.
So in other words, we just can't say minimum. We need to know what that number is. So I would suggest
That's down
that
at 22 and 23
Right.
is
There
where
are
we start talking about those.
specifics proposed in here.
Yeah, one space per two-unit, two-bedroom.
In
Well,
looking
we
at
also
this,
talked about this in 13, where we already voted too. So where we decided we would do it by bedrooms if they were more than 2 bedrooms. So again, all I'm suggesting is, because of that, we might want to come back and ask staff to put together some numbers for. In other words, rather than just talking out of the blue here, I really have no idea what I'm
But the numbers are on the other ones to discuss later.
right. So let me just suggest, if we look ahead to a few of the action items, it might help facilitate the discussion about, well, after you set the basic minimum and maximum, what flexibility do you want to grant? I take it from this that we're really looking at, this question of, is it, for the minimum, is it 0.5 or 0.75? I know Walnut's example is 0.5, and residential I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But is it 0.5, or like in eWeb, we bumped it up to 0.75? And I guess one of the key questions is, where is the commission going to land on that question, just residential? And then, the question for the ratio, the basic ratio for minimum, I think it's based on square footage for non-residential. So it might help to start with 23 or those where there's specifics involved. Actually, 22.
22 and 23.
22.
It really gets at it.
Should we vote on 15? Because basically
think
it seems
let's-
like it's a moot.
Well, I think the idea is to take a look at 22 and 23 and then come back to 15.
Let's do that.
Yeah. Commissioner Baker.
Well, I'd suggest we set the residential minimum at 0.75, because we don't really want, that's 3/4 of the space for, and mostly we're talking about 2-bedroom units.
So on 22, you're suggesting
Not one space, but it's 0.75.
not 1, but 0.75?
Right.
Okay.
With a reduction.
No. That
Throwing the reductions out.
the reduction's already thrown in. So we're
Okay,
just
so-
setting. It's 0.75, and then we would add.
Okay, so right now it says 1, and a 25% reduction applies per current code.
Right. So
Let's just call it 0.75.
right, and then you would apply the same reduction for the 0.5, so it would be 0.375 or for each additional bedroom.
So
In other words, to make it essentially the starting point is having it consistent with the existing West University and SUNA and eWeb plan. Those are the numbers that are used. Yeah. So
Okay.
what I've heard so far
Yeah.
is that rather than 1 space per dwelling unit for up to 2 bedrooms, I'm hearing 0.75
From one person.
spaces from one person.
0.75.
from one
Yeah.
person. Yeah.
With
Okay.
the additional 25% reduction or without?
No, without,
Okay.
because he wanted a raw number.
Okay.
And also that
So just 0.75 across the board?
for residential, and then for additional bedrooms beyond 2, you add 0.375, whatever that magic 25% times.
Okay. So number 23 makes a different recommendation. I just want to point that out.
Right.
And so it sounds like what we're going to have to do is choose. If there's yet another recommendation on the table that's different from either of these two, we should add that in as well.
Okay. I've got Commissioner Jaworski.
Yeah, maybe I'm not up on what the reductions mean. I just thought when we talked that we were going to send minimum and maximums and reductions didn't apply. From my perspective, I don't even want to talk about reductions for this area. I just want to say minimum and maximums and throw reductions out.
Then you'd vote
So
no
I'd like
on
to have
22.
that discussion. Well,
Yeah.
I'd like to have that clarified. Otherwise, I can't support anything if reductions are in, even though I like the number. So I need to know if this Planning Commission wants reductions in or out. As simple as that.
I have Commissioner Taylor, then Commissioner Mills, and Borowski. I'm sorry.
I'm not sure where to start with one. I would like to know, can you tell us what is, in a second, because I have a couple more questions, the downtown riverfront residential requirements? Because it seems like that's the model that actually,
Yeah.
Okay, so that's it. I personally don't think this neighborhood is compatible or a good comparison with West University neighborhood, SUNA, or Fairmont. This is not a university neighborhood. So I really want to stress that. The idea of providing excess parking per bedroom, quite frankly, I don't think it's applicable. I think what we're going to see is the trend that's identified that was talked about trends to the neighborhood and business owners when staff met with them, is that the trend is that empty nesters, young adults, young families that can buy a property, have a home that's affordable. So if we're talking, anyways, I just want to put that out there in terms of, I keep hearing the comparison being SUNA. So to me, I would like to hear what the requirements are for a neighborhood that's maybe more compatible.
Sure. So in the downtown riverfront special area zone, actually the most recently adopted special area zone, it's 0.75 off-street parking spaces per dwelling unit with a maximum of 2.25.
And are there specific reductions allowed if things happen? Like there's a transit stop in front or...
No.
Okay.
It's relatively simple in that regard, but the flexibility there, I think, is really in terms of where. Again, the question of the ability to do off-street parking, but with a lease agreement. In the case of the downtown riverfront, it was allowed anywhere within the special area zone or a quarter mile of the district. So it was rather flexible.
It was rather flexible. Great.
In that way.
So I guess I would like to make a proposal that that be considered for this area. And that is 0.75 minimum off-street parking per dwelling unit and 2.25 maximum. And the reductions would be either quarter mile or within the Willamette Special Area Study. I'm getting the title wrong. South Willamette Special Area Study.
In
So
essence,
the off-street parking would be within that area.
Yeah.
Okay.
we'll add that to the list.
Okay. I think, Commissioner Borowski, then Commissioner Mills. I'm sorry I didn't write it down in order.
So for me, what would be helpful is at 22, I'm not exactly sure what number we're using when we go to the second column as what would happen if we did that. See what I'm saying? So is it 0.75 space would trigger what staff believes is going to happen in the next column, or is it one space?
It's one.
It's one, but then what about the 25% reduction that's in the... That's where I'm confused.
Okay, well, let me see if I can clarify. So what it says in the second column, those are considerations,
Right.
basically. that
And
we're
that's what I'm
listing.
basing my
Yeah.
decisions on.
So if there would, and those considerations were based on one, I'm just thinking now about whether they would still be true if it was only .75, and I believe it would be, because the minimum parking requirement for residential use today is one space per dwelling unit, and it doesn't define how many bedrooms that is, except in special areas.
Okay.
And so this is actually proposing something that would be 1.75 spaces per dwelling unit up to 2 bedrooms, and then another half a space. So if you had a 3-bedroom house or if you had a 3-bedroom apartment, then you'd have 1.25 spaces required for that, which would be more than existing code. And so the question is, what is the average
Okay.
bedroom count?
And
per
that's what I
dwelling
needed to
unit?
know.
Yeah.
I see what staff feels that proposal would, the consequences may be. And so I needed to know what that actual number was. And so you're saying that by adding more spaces with the bedroom would possibly do these consequences.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Mills.
Yeah, I guess 2 or 3 comments. Let me start. I guess I'm very much in favor of what Gabe has suggested in terms of minimums and maximums and simplicity along the lines of the model of the riverfront property. I guess I would caution everybody, in my mind, they are not similar areas at all, that being the riverfront and South Willamette. I mean, the density, the building types and so on, I think you're looking at a far higher density in the riverfront area than you are in South Willamette. And I'm not suggesting that should make you think one way or another.
No,
just that
you're
you
right.
need to
That's
really
a good
remember that those are not the same. In addition, in the eWeb area, you have a great deal of flexibility over time in the availability of, I'll call it temporary or interim surface parking that can alleviate a lot of the pressures. So there's a lot going on in the riverfront area that is different than South Willamette. We really need to keep that in mind. I wouldn't just go and say, yeah, it's good there, it's good here. We really need to keep in mind how they're different. But I think, having said that, I think the model of consistency and minimums and maximums versus percent reductions is where I want to be.
Right.
I've got myself in the queue. Just wanted to respond to what Commissioner Taylor said, and I agree with Commissioner Mills that they're not the same. However, my feeling is that .75 per dwelling unit as a minimum and the 2.25 as a maximum gives a pretty generous range as you're laying that out. And I think what is attracting me to that, and I believe this would address the issues that we have in items 15, 22, and 23, is that going to something like that, whether we agree on the .75 and the 2.25, I like the simplicity of that with no reductions, and that off-site within maybe a quarter mile, or just really, we spent a lot of time vetting riverfront, and if we can agree that there's enough flexibility there that the dissimilarities between riverfront and South Willamette work, I think for me, at least right now, it seems to work. I'd be willing to support that. But I don't remember who was next, if it was Commissioner Taylor, then Baker, I think.
I just want to, thank you. I'm speaking very short because I have a terrible migraine right now, so I'm not being, so I apologize. So yes, they're not identical. You're right. So my end comment was actually going to be that's consistent with what you said. The biggest difference, and yes, there are a lot of differences between the two. I find them more similar in some components than the university outline, or the neighborhoods that are adjacent to the university. One of the biggest differences that I see that we're going to have to address, once again, is that parking. And that's what we stressed earlier on in the meeting, is in order to do this, I think we do need to have that opportunity for shared parking that's not just negotiated by the private sector. If we're going to be more aggressive, both from commercial and residential, in having maximums and allowing reductions, really make sure there is that opportunity. I mean, even from the private side, if people decide to develop and not take property to allocate additional parking, we're kind of stuck. I mean, it's going to where's the parking going to go? And quite frankly, I mean, I'd love for this to be a walkable neighborhood right away. The bottom line is we still use our cars, and we don't have that yet necessarily.
Commissioner Baker and then Commissioner Jaworski, and we're past time. So,
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to come back and make the point that EWEB is very different in that there's no place, if there's no parking there, you're not pushing the parking into some adjacent residential area that doesn't have, parking controls now. There's no available additional parking in that area except, Fifth Street, metered parking. In other words, there isn't a choice. And make 3 points. If we don't provide enough residential parking in some of these areas, then it'll be pushed into the adjacent neighborhoods. That's where the parking, that's where people will store their cars. And the third point is, if we're talking about small units and empty nesters, then 2 bedrooms is more than adequate, and there wouldn't be any additional parking requirements. We're only I was only proposing additional requirements so you don't have the situation where some people decide it's more attractive to build 4-bedroom units. We don't have any control over that. And this way, at least, there's additional parking required so that they put less of a burden on the adjacent areas. And, those are the 3 points that I'd like to make. That, that's it.
okay. Commissioner Jaworski.
I'm supportive of the min and max proposed. I believe it was also that off-street be within the area. By area, you might mean the South Willamette area, but depending on where it is in that area, it could be outside the area, but very close. So I have a little question on that. I think if we agree on that, saying no reductions, then we've answered 15, 21, 22, and 23. But do the no reductions only apply to the 25 and 50%, and how does that affect 16 and 20 in our discussion? Because that gets more confusing. If we're not going to allow anything, how does 16 and 20 fit in? And then I'd be feeling really good if we could answer 16 and 20, because I'd feel we're there.
Maybe, here's a suggestion. We've got several options on the table. We're past time today, so we're obviously going to need to revisit this. But I'm wondering if we combined in our thinking and our thought process between now and next meeting, if we look at all of those parking issues, the 15, 21, 22, 23, and I think John said 16 and 20. In light of a proposal to maybe try and simplify that and keep that, because I'm hearing a number of commissioners that I think are willing to look at simplifying that, whether we're at the 0.75, 2.25, and some of that, but I'm kind of hearing a little bit of a trend that way, and maybe I'm hopeful thinking or something.
We could bring a concept back. I recognize there are a number of these suggestions here that are sorting through them can be challenging. So we'll try to come up with some way to.
This is just a potpourri of what we have come up
that
with over the time,
and have either one or more concrete options that we can select from. Right. Streamline that process a little bit.
Okay.
And I think that that's actually going to be true of a couple more items later on in this list.
Yeah, 27 I think is another one. Commissioner Baker mentioned.
Yep.
Okay. Does that sound agreeable, Commissioner Borowski?
Can you just tell us, in the plan there was several references to an open house with the Planning Commission. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. Just briefly.
When, where, what you're envisioning?
It hasn't been scheduled yet, and it's largely dependent on this process and our ability to craft the code in time to have it presented and posted online and ready for that. The idea was, and we did this in the past with a concept plan where we had an open house. You have a final draft of the concept plan in the room. You have staff in the room to answer questions for people. You invite the public to look and ask questions, whatever they want to do. The Planning Commission, as many of you as can be there, as many of you will be there as can be there, can hear directly from the public what their questions are, what their concerns are. And so it's just a more informal way to get in touch with the community about the project. And that was a suggestion that we could do that. If you're still interested in that, we could. We will, of course, still have a public hearing, so if you think it's maybe redundant with that, then we could do that. We would have a public open house anyway, where we would present the actual letters of the code, the actual code language. So it's just a matter of whether or not you want to participate in that. And it's not scheduled yet, but I would expect at least a month out, if not more.
So, Robin, what would be our next meeting to address this? The rest of these items?
Next meeting would be next Monday, I believe. We don't have anything scheduled for Monday, so I'd propose that we just...
I think while it's still fresh in our minds, that would
Yeah.
be good.
Right.
So
Yep.
we'll reconvene next Monday.
Okay.
Okay. Any other items from staff,
You've been fantastic.
from commission?
Oh, my gosh. No, you were so
Okay.
good.
We're adjourned.
So good.